just going to take you into this exhibition now. Just as a quick overview, this is over 160 works, 44 of the drawings from the Prado in Madrid. First time we've ever had a body of work of this scale in the country. So it's an extraordinary opportunity to look at one of the great revolutionary artists of their time. An artist who was also very concerned with not only the mark making and work on paper as an important practice in his own right, although he's known as a painter. The last 30 years very much about the work on paper as a primary practice, but also somebody who was a great humanitarian. He talks about social justice and all the sort of inequalities that he saw in society. Really very much ahead of his time in so many ways. So it's an absolute honour to have this on as well at this time.
But as you're walking in, here is Goya greeting you. So you probably have heard of Goya, the best-known Spanish artist of his period and possibly best-known Spanish artist of all time, arguably, but he was a court painter and he also had a position at the Royal Academy in Madrid in the 1780s. So he's very much an established painter working at the highest level. And at the same time as painting portraits and religious paintings, Goya also worked on drawings and prints. So this is what we're showing in this exhibition, and what makes it so special is that all of these works on paper were uncommissioned. So he wasn't working for a patron who was paying him to make a particular kind of work. And that means Goya was free to be critical. He could voice his personal views, but also make satirical works and works that responded to current events. So this is what he's doing in the works in this room. Now Goya was in his mid-40s in 1792 when he suffered a near-fatal illness, and it left him profoundly deaf. So this is while he was a court painter and he was very established. And this is when he turns to drawing. So before that he had made some sketches, as all artists do, preparatory, small drawings. But the drawings we have here, he really started to make in the late 1790s. And the drawings are actually quite resolved compositions. They're not just observational sketches, they're almost like finished works in their own right. And he draws in albums and also on single sheets, and he makes preparatory drawings for his prints. And what we've done in the exhibition with the 44 works that we've loaned from the Prado is we've integrated them into our print collection. So everything you see that's on a white panel is a drawing from the Prado. And the entire room is given over to the Caprichos, the Follies, which was Goya's first series of prints published in 1799. And the related drawings that are sometimes the works made for the prints, and other times they're thematically connected to the works. In the first section, which you've just walked through on the white and light-coloured walls, it's basically the first half of the Capriccio series, and they're very much social satires. So Goya is looking at the relationship between men and women, courtship rituals, but also prostitution. He's looking at the kind of trickery and deception that occurs when men and women try to impress each other, but also the kind of trickery and deception at play. And what Goya is really wanting to do is he wants to unmask that kind of masquerade in the social world and reveal the truth behind what really motivates us. And I think his insight into human nature and behaviour, his astute observations really make these works so recognisable. They speak to us very directly because we recognise all of those behaviours, because these are things that don't change. They're universal subjects. From the relationship between men and women, he goes on to critique education, of course, Goya was a man of the Enlightenment. Education was a very important tool in reform. Goya knew a lot of the liberal thinkers and reformers of his time because he painted their portraits, and he was aware of political and social debates around reform of education, agriculture, the role of the church, all kinds of political issues. So that wall there is dedicated to the critique of education and also punishment, corporeal punishment of children, but also in adulthood, excessive punishment of people incarcerated, people victims of the Inquisition. Here we go into a more allegorical theme with the donkeys right behind you on that wall. So he uses animals, shows them performing human roles and human professions as well, which reminds me of our current sort of political situation in which we have politicians in high office who aren't trained to be professionals in their job. All of these themes are really very much contemporary themes. This here is a really key work in the exhibition, in the Caprichos. It's positioned halfway through the series, but it is a self-portrait, and it's called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. And here Goya is asleep at the desk, and the sleep of reason is bringing forth these monsters, the irrational, the power of the imagination. And if you think as the first half of this room and this series, the Caprichos, as social observations, sort of invented scenarios that mock the follies and vices he sees in society, this midpoint of the series really introduces the second part, which we've displayed on these dark walls, because that takes you into the realm of the imagination, the monsters and witches and hybrid creatures that populate that nocturnal world, and he uses them very much as allegories of falsehood, fear, superstition and ignorance. And I'm going to hand over to Cathy now, who's going to talk a little bit more about that part.
The artist's first series, which contains 80 plates, and we've hung the works here on these very dark walls because this part of the series deals with supernatural themes, and it introduces a cast of quite extraordinary characters, witches, goblins, monsters, hybrid creatures that we really see here in Goya's art for the first time. And these creatures, these fantastic supernatural creatures, first appeared in Goya's work in a group of 28 drawings called Dreams, Sueños, that were made in around 1797. And these Sueños drawings are the compositions in which Goya worked out his ideas for the Caprichos series. And the first, the self-portrait that Petra's just spoken about, the sleep of reason that produces monsters, the Sueños drawing for that was number 1. This is the second Sueños drawing, and as I mentioned, there are 28 of them. So Goya inscribed each of these drawings with the term Sueños, dream, and a number on the top, or sometimes it's just the number, and an inscription at the bottom that gives us a key to the work. And so the use of this term dream. The dream was a very was a literary device that had a very long tradition in Spain, stretched back to the early 17th century, and it was a device that allowed fantasy to be used to critique society. And so Goya draws upon that device to both ridicule contemporary superstitions and ignorances and belief in creatures like goblins and witches, but he also uses it in a more allegorical way to really condemn some of the evil practices that he saw in society around him. So that's the Sueños. So the first 10 of the Sueños drawings are of witches, and they show novice witches being taught how to be a witch. Other things that are being criticised here, this extraordinary image of a witch using a child to blow as a bellows to fuel the flames of the brazier alongside. Commentaries on this image talk about this old hag-like witch, about elderly people being predating on young children. The image alongside, the famous image from the series called Pretty Teacher, again a novice witch being introduced to being a witch, and this broomstick is very suggestively placed between her thighs. So this is a commentary on the procuress and prostitution. So by using these evil creatures, Goya is really condemning in a very acerbic way some of these ills that he saw. On the back wall just behind you, we have a number of images that look at the aristocracy, the nobility, the chinchillas. The third image on the left, you've got two figures who are who are unable to function for themselves. Their arms are bound by their side by the heraldic devices, as are their ears, and they need to be fed by the peasantry upon whom they depend. And on the back wall, just as before we leave this space, a group of images looking at the abuses of the clergy.
And in the early 1800s, nothing very significant happens in Spain and in Goya's life, and that is the Peninsular War, which the Spanish call the War of Independence. Napoleon's troops invade Portugal and Spain in 1807, and by 1808 the Spanish resist the invasion, and that triggers the War of Independence, which then quickly descends into a civil war, and all of Spain is implicated in this 6-year brutal conflict. Goya is sent to Zaragoza, which is the city where he spent his youth, to document some of the destruction of the city, and that's when he starts making drawings for the disasters of war. This is a series of 80 prints that he produces, and one thing that's really interesting about this is, again, we need to remember that Goya was a court painter, the official painter to the king. He was making massive oil paintings about the Spanish resistance, which are the kinds of paintings you would expect as commissioned paintings, very heroic, grand scale. But at the same time as making those, he was making those uncommissioned works, which is the disasters of war. These works on the wall are 4 drawings from the Prado related to the series, along with 15 prints from the Art Gallery of South Australia, who have an unbound. And we've selected particular images that represent the series because it starts off with scenes of some harrowing violence and even mutilation. So this is the conflict of war, and there's an extraordinary realism in that. No one else was representing war like Goya at this time. It's almost as if he's testing our courage to see the very worst of humanity. And in a similar way in which in the capriccios and the social satires he was trying to unmask, what people were sort of trying to hide, unmask our social etiquette and masquerade. Here he is sort of really revealing the truth about the experience of war. He's not sparing us anything. And in the second part of the series, he talks about the effect on civilians, and that includes violence against women, famine, and refugees. And again, these images look so modern to me. He puts people in the centre of every image. You don't get the sort of conventional narrative of heroic and human rights and justice for all.
I am going to talk about Goya's last years, just looking briefly at his last series of prints, dating from about 1815 to 19, and his last drawing. So we're really looking at Goya when he's 70 years of age, right through to he died when he was 82. And this period, Goya had withdrawn from the public eye. He was no longer working actively as a court painter. He was 70. There were younger court artists who were more in favour. He still did some occasional portraits and a couple of religious commissions, but he was really intensely engaged in drawing practice, and there's a whole sequence of albums from these years, and printmaking as well. And the last etch series that he made is this series here, the Disparates, and it's one of the most enigmatic and kind of darkest or most pessimistic sort of series of works. And it's thought of often as conceptually kind of aligned to the black paintings, those paintings the murals that Goya made on the walls of the villa on the outskirts of Madrid in about 1819. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with those, that very bleak imagery of Satan devouring his child, witches, Sabbaths, kind of great crowds of people moving through space. But there's a great ambiguity about the images, and they have a kind of nightmarish quality that kind of combines or melds kind of reality and fantasy, but in a dreamwork-like way. Some of the themes that we know from the earlier Caprichos and his earlier works reappear here, but really what we're seeing, they're bleaker, and it's a much more grotesque vision that we see in the Disparates. The images have been read in terms of, in relation to Carnival, the festive season when the authorities are debunked, when masquerades and it becomes a topsy-turvy world, so figures like Babalicon, the big buffoon, the giant buffoon, is a carnival figure. But there are other images that deal with lasciviousness and lust, like Merry Folly, which is further up there. But then there are images such as this, which really have evaded a kind of specific meaning, where you see this huddled group of figures seated on a branch, one person talking at them, not knowing what. There's, interpretations are many and varied. And disparate kind of roughly translates as irrational folly or absurdity. And so the series now is known as Los Disparates. And in its kind of thematics, the period following Ferdinand VII's restoration to power in 1814 was a very dangerous political climate, when liberals were exiled or punished, where himself had to appear before the Inquisition, and it was a dangerous political climate. The kind of liberal ideas that they'd been fighting for, that had been established in the Constitution, were overturned by Ferdinand. The Inquisition was re-established, the press was tied down, and so it was a bleak period. And so that is the kind of thought to be the backdrop to these these plates, the Los Disparates. And
This is one of Goya's very late drawings that he made in France in the last 4 years of his life, and it's called Fountain Dancing with Castanets. One of the reasons I really like it is that it actually repeats a figure that you see throughout his work in earlier series, but here it's particularly absurd, and it's humorous and it's critical. It just sums up to me a typical Goyesque image.
He's slightly menacing, isn't
He's
it?
menacing.
There's something slightly...
And he's carnivalesque, and he's playing castanets as well, which has a suggestive meaning. well, and he's dressed in monk's robes.
It's from album C, which is Goya's largest album. It's 126 leaves, and 120 of them are in the Prado. And it's made after the war, and it's quite pessimistic. It's quite a bleak album, and it has a whole series of drawings that depict beggars, victims of the war, prisoners. This is an image of a victim of Inquisition, and she's a known figure. Her name is Arosia Moreno, and Goya writes on her tunic. You know, they put a gag on her and slapped her in the face. I saw her, Arosia Moreno, in Zaragoza for knowing how to make mice. And there was a witch trial, or a heresy trial actually, for her in 1762. Goya would have been 14, so it's possible that he saw it. But he often uses that term, I saw it, as well as a kind of device. He shows, you know, there's this kind of crowd behind. It's one of his images where he's really criticising the Inquisition. The final inscription is for knowing how to make mice, which of course is witchcraft.
Can you address the two sides to Goya? There was the establishment side, and there was the darker Gothic side. Can you just speak to that briefly?
He was a very complex person, so he was very adept at pleasing his patrons on the one hand, because he served 4 successive monarchs, which isn't easy, especially when one of them is French and 3 of them is Spanish. So he managed to keep his position at the court through these very turbulent years, and also he was paid a pension by the king until the end of his life, even after he left Spain and lived in France for the last 4 years of his life. But while he was working at the court, and for quite a few years at the Royal Academy as well, he was making private works. His drawings were private. Of course, his prints were meant to be published and disseminated. So, but all of these works are uncommissioned works, so that means Goya could be personal, he could voice his political views, he could respond to events in the world, in politics, in the social world, and he could be critical within reason. The Inquisition was around, and the consequences of scrutiny and censorship were very real. Many of Goya's enlightened friends, reformers and liberal thinkers, had to go into exile and were incarcerated. So he had to be very careful not to target specific individuals in his work, but he used the device of the dream and allegory to make statements about vice and folly, injustice, and this could range from the clergy, aristocracy. The church also was very much involved in land holding, and farmers didn't get much of the income.
It's surprising that he lived that long and that he wasn't called out.
Yes.
He was very, very astute, and the public work, the court, he was commissioned for portraits, and there were conventions, established conventions, and he worked within those. And that's one of the reasons that he was so interested in drawing, is that it gave him the opportunity to work outside those kind of strictures. They enabled him to follow his kind of fantasy or imagination and invention. So the drawings were very much personal or private. They all have captions, nearly all of them have captions. And Goya would arrange them in sequences in the album, and he'd sort of sometimes rearrange the sequences. So he develops a kind of narrative across the group of works, and the fact that they've got captions means he's kind of creating commentaries, and so it's thought that they were shared, that they were shared amongst this kind of elite circle or kind of close circle of similar-minded people.
What do you think it was that accounted for his use of goblins and witches and demons and otherworldly figures from the netherworld?
I think there's a couple of things. One is that there is a history of that iconography in Western art. If you think about Hieronymus Bosch and all those crazy hybrid creatures, and also even in Jura and Calla and Salvador Rosa, monstrous creatures who are trying to tempt or seduce people, and often saints and holy people, to engage in vice. It's a representation of evil. And he draws on that iconography, but he does something very original with it. And of course it's also in the context of late 18th century Spain, which was steeped in superstition, and Goya also responds to that very directly. And there were street festivals where people dressed up as witches and goblins, so it was all around visually. And
there were stage plays.
yes, so it's in popular culture.
There were plays about witchcraft. I mean, there was a huge interest in witchcraft. He created cabinet pictures for some members of the aristocracy.
To say that Goya was ahead of his time is an understatement. The picture he did of the firing squad remains a stunning pre-echo of so many images that have come out of war. Even in Vietnam, we've seen pictures that look remarkably like that image. Goya was the grandfather of Goth. It is no secret that modern filmmakers making horror films have used his imagery. I'd like you guys to address this prescience that he had and the impact he's obviously had on modern culture, both with war photography and with filmmaking.
It's as if he anticipates, as is the modern war photography, and I think it's just they're such strikingly modern images, and the way he takes us close up to what he depicts in those war etchings. He does claim in at least one of them that he saw what he's representing, and we're not sure if he did. There are debates going on about this. One of the plates actually is called "I Saw It." But Goya, the reality is he was in his early 60s when the war broke out. He's unlikely to have seen very much, so he's basically inventing scenarios based on stories and reports he's seen. But he does it in such a striking, immediate way, and the way in which he shows the execution, where you don't even see the French soldiers executing. You see the points of their rifles in the corner of the image, but it gives you this shock, like the execution is just a second away. The other really interesting thing about that, and what is cinematic about it as well, is that he, in that painting, the 3rd of May, but also in similar etchings in the Disasters of War, he brings in an element of time. So you see this one situation of the person about to be executed, but in the background there are people who are about to suffer the same fate, and in the foreground there's a dead body on the floor, so it's already happened. So it puts you into this sequence, this temporal sequence of what has just occurred and what is about to occur. So it takes you into a whole narrative.
I guess the other thing you would say is, he's on the cusp of the Romantic era, and so the interest in kind of, reason and the irrational and the kind of motivating forces behind human behaviour. If you look at artists like Huxley and Blake as well, at the same time, they're starting to explore those same ideas in different ways. Kind of the very strongly social element is kind of unique to Goya, I think. But looking at kind of universally applicable human behaviour, the kind of self-deception, the kind of irrational impulses that compel one to to certain types of behaviour, the kind of predisposition to violence. I think all of these things are, taking those as subjects is what makes, the work resonate today, but also to make it seem kind of or modern, give it its modernity.
Well, this is one of Goya's many images of prisoners, especially around this time, just after the war. He was very concerned about excessive punishment, and it was common to use shackles and chains in Spanish prisons. Goya visited a mental asylum. He may well have visited a prison as well. So he was attracted to these sort of extremes. It's as if he wants to lay bare what humans are capable of doing to each other, and outline, really emphasise the injustice of it. And of course the abolition of torture was part of the liberal reform agenda of the Enlightenment thinkers who argued for human rights.